Again, I'm Kim Mayer. I'm the executive director of the Old Stone House in Park Slope, Brooklyn. We are so happy to be partnering with the Brooklyn Book Festival for this official Brooklyn Book Festival Bookend event, Leaning into Death, a conversation about changing the way we think about the end of life and some books that are informing this change. Some housekeeping details for all of you. Members of the audience are muted. And if you have questions, you can put your questions in the chat and we'll save them for the Q&A at the end of the conversation. And you can also pre-order David R. Roth's book, and there'll be information about that in the chat, along with some other suggested reading. So now I'd like to introduce our moderator, David R. Roth. David has an undergraduate degree from Stanford University and an MFA from Cedar Crest College. He has studied writing at New York University, Drexel University's Story Lab, and the American University in Paris. His short stories have appeared in Passenger Journal, Moss, and Every Writer. His work focuses on fictional lives lived in fictional river towns in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, his real home for decades. The Femme Fatale Hypothesis is his debut novel. David?
Thanks, appreciate it, Kim. What are we to do with death? Murder mysteries are always resolved in the end, the mystery neatly dispelled. We must do the same with death in our lives. Resolve it, give it meaning, put it in context, however hard that might be. If I'd read those lines from Jan Martel's The High Mountains of Portugal before I sent my manuscript of the Femme Fatale Hypothesis over to my publisher, I probably would have had that as an epigraph. The years immediately preceding and encompassing my writing of the book were marked by deaths of people close to me. One of my sisters, my mother, my uncle, a close friend, my mother and father-in-law. I was intimately involved with these people's lives and their deaths, good and bad deaths. So spoiler alert, major themes running through the novel are grief and death. I've spent a lot of time both experiencing these topics and reading about what I was experiencing. So beginning many years ago with The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, whose thesis is that our search for meaning in our lives is spurred by our fear that death actually negates the life we live. More recently, I read Die Wise by Stephen Jenkinson, who speaks about, among many, many other things, the medical community's assumed role to protect us from the experience of our death. And he includes in that palliative and hospice care workers. Of course, I read a lot of books of fiction that deal with aging and death, like Kent Harouf's Our Souls at Night. Many that focus on the plague of dementia, like Alice Munro's The Bear Goes Over the Mountain, or Lisa Genoa's Still Alice. I also wrote about research into Alzheimer's disease for over a decade. And the experience of reading and writing about death led me to a personal conclusion, very personal conclusion, that when we are privileged enough not to have our lives snuffed out unexpectedly, if our death approaches and we retain the agency necessary to do so, I feel we have an obligation to ourselves and our loved ones to lean into death and to accept its inevitability and embrace it as our final life-affirming act. And reading and writing also has brought me to wonder how other people think about death. And it is this curiosity that brought us to this conversation. Art critic Peter Schjeldahl provided a great nudge at the end of his New Yorker essay, The Art of Dying. He says, "Take death for a walk in your minds, folks. Either you will be glad you did, or keeling over suddenly, you won't be out anything." So let's begin our walk. I'm joined today in this conversation by two people whose personal and professional lives have been filled with both life and death. Martha Roth-Irwin is my sister and one of my heroes, and she is now an end-of-life midwife who spent 30 years as a birth doula and midwife, attending to the needs of families at the beginning of life. And Marcy Tardio is a new acquaintance for whom I already have tremendous respect. She's been a healthcare provider for 40 years, first as an RN in oncology and the ICU, and then as a midwife. And she's now a second-year Master of Divinity student on a Buddhist track with a concentration in chaplaincy at Union Theological Seminary. Marcy, Martha, thank you so much for joining me today. Appreciate it. What I want to do is I want to start by noting that you both have backgrounds in midwifery. By way of further introduction, could you please share with folks a bit about your respective backgrounds and experiences and what inspired you to transition from beginning of life work to end of life work? Martha, you want to start us off?
Sure, thank you. First, I'd like to thank you, Dave, for inviting me to participate in this conversation and congratulate you on your publication of your novel, The Femme Fatale Hypothesis. Because for many of us, the beauty of an intimate story well told is what we thrive on. And the bonus for me is that this story you've crafted provides a perfect opening for conversations like this one. And thank you, Marcy Tardio, my colleague and mentor, for bringing your considerable gifts to this conversation. So in answer to your question, there are really three formative experiences that have come up for me that guided me into my midwifery practice and then the transition to what I refer to as end-of-life midwifery. And unfortunately, like many, if not most women, I received unethical and dangerous medical treatment as a young woman. I recognized early on in my young adult life that this male-dominated medical model of the American for-profit system could not be trusted with my care, which left me with an unresolved feeling that there needed to be a better way. So luckily then, within a few years of my unfortunate medical experiences, my slightly older sister, to whom I looked up with great admiration, gave birth at home with the guidance of midwives. I saw her trust in the woman and family-centered model of care and in herself proved to be the primary catalyst for my returning to school and becoming a midwife myself. The model of care I provided was informed by the care that I wanted to receive. And then sadly, I will say the third formative experience was 25 years later. That same sister guided me with exceptional grace to my transition to the end-of-life midwifery when I cared for her during the final months of her life. She taught me that the same skills and instincts that I had used in my birthing midwifery practice were the same ones needed during the dying time. Listening, protecting the space from fear and unnecessary interventions, and honoring the wishes of the dying without judgment. Her name was Etta, which I say with gratitude for the everyday courage and compassion she exhibited around birthing, living, and dying, and that I was lucky enough to witness. Thank you.
Thanks, Martha. Marcy?
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Martha. Like Martha, my journey began also with my own health and with birth. It started with birth when I was young and got to witness my first birth, which was a footling breech baby in a log cabin in the mountains of West Virginia, which led to my own home birth a few years later when I became a young mother. And at that time, I learned about owning your choice. As a 20-year-old, it was unusual that I know now, as an elder, of what it means to own your choice, to think about the possibilities of your choice and to lay claim to it. All of the life transitions seem to mark the journey of my life. From my own birth, I went to nursing school to become a midwife. When I thought that midwifery was what I wanted to do and I graduated, I realized I wanted to understand other life transitions. And so I became a nurse in oncology and people with cancer, and then trauma ICU and a medical ICU where I was caring for young men in the very early stages of AIDS. I worked in different arenas in midwifery where I returned to my original path. And ultimately, like Martha, had a home birth practice, which makes you think more deeply about laying claim to your choice, because it is not a popular choice in our society where we, whether it's in childbirth or in end of life, we tend to give over power to the medical professionals, thinking we don't know, they must know.
Mhm.
And this, in the midst of my midwifery career, I ended up becoming sick and had kidney failure, and was on kidney dialysis, had an 8-year-old at home. And as I had been with siblings at their own births, at the births of their mothers, I included my 8-year-old with my own home dialysis to make it normal and not make it so frightening, the way that much of healthcare is, where we lock it behind the doors of the hospitals, and it's not within the context of family. As well, I received a kidney from my older son, which brings another ethical issue to have thought about, which is letting your child, who you're supposed to protect, go under the knife for you. This continued with my mom failing in dementia and ultimately dying, and my discovering that the elder care that we have in our society does not work. And I found solace with chaplains. A woman whose babies I had delivered also had been a hospice chaplain, and when I would speak with her, it felt like I was talking to a midwife. And lastly, when my career in birth was winding down, I no longer wanted to be a clinician, but I knew that I knew how to sit and listen. And what I'm learning now in seminary is about listening deeply. And that's what it's all about, whether it's in birth or illness or end of life, is what does it mean to listen deeply and just sit with people.
Interesting. Yeah, a lot of interesting stuff there. Martha, you're talking about Etta teaching you, not you, necessarily being there and instructing her on how to go about dying. And Marcy, the whole conversation there about the transition to listening at the end and your own personal experiences, all sort of steering away from the medical community. I think that's interesting. Well, I'm sure we're going to talk more about that. But right now, what I want to do is I want to just step back again into this conversation that we're having, and that is, I actually find it discussions about death and intellectually and emotionally uplifting. Maybe I'm a little weird about this, but I'm often moved to pay more attention and act with greater courage in my daily life after spending time talking about thoughts of death. Not merely its inevitability, of course, but the opportunity it presents to arrive at a place in our lives characterized by something other than fear and regret. I suspect that many, if not most people, think talking about death is maybe a little depressing. I wonder, Marcy, if you can talk about death can be depressing, but why do you think we should intentionally engage in such a conversation?
I bring this back. Yes, I bring this back to. I bring thinking about death not unlike thinking about birth, thinking about illness, thinking about choice. That this is our lives, and that death is not just dying; it's living until we're no longer alive. So it's part of the thought of how do we want to live, as well. We're thinking about our loved ones. It's a very tender subject. No one wants to think of ourselves not being here. But when we talk about it, we can let our desires be known, so that if we can't speak in our own behalf, the people who are closest to us know what we want. We know that there's a great deal of stress and complications within families when it comes to making decisions for someone that they love. And this normalizes it. When we lean into death, lean into illness, lean into birth, we are leaning into the part of the realities, the very important realities of life. And we can, again, lay claim. We have more agency when we do this.
So I love that you know, it's about how you want to live, not how you want to die. I like that. Martha, you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I think the issue of language being so important, and the great fear of talking about the fact that you will no longer be a physical presence on the earth is very hard for some people. I had a personal experience with a family where they could not get their elderly mother to even imagine what that the earth would continue, the world would continue as she knew it without her in it. So the family had absolutely no opportunity, before she lost her agency to discuss it, to talk to her about how she would like to die, how she would like to be cared for until she died. And so this, again, these conversations that I have the pleasure, I agree with you, it's a pleasure when I get a call from a family where they would like to be able to sit and talk and use the language that will normalize the situation, and also give that gift, I guess you could even say the gift of life, of the remainder of the life, to whomever, whether it's family or your community, whoever will be with you throughout the rest of your life and your death. It's a gift to communicate your desires to them. And so I feel this conversation is about finding that language that we want to use that can eliminate some of the fear and anxiety that is infused into even the word when someone says, oh, she's dying, and all of a sudden everybody pulls back. No need to lean in.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I'm going to pick up on that, on the fear factor in a second. I want to talk more about that. It's very interesting to me that how often that does come up. It seems to be at the root of the struggle a lot of people have with talking about death and anything other than just sort of getting their affairs in order. And it's in some of the reading that I've been doing and I've encountered, it's actually a pathological fear of death we seem to have in this culture. You know, what I'd like to do is pick up that thought with a short excerpt from an essay by Roger Scruton, who was a conservative English philosopher who wrote an essay titled "Dying in Time." It's in his collection Confessions of a Heretic, which published right about the time, right before, just after he died. The essay asks, you know, how do you achieve a timely death against advances in modern medicine? And the entire essay is really well worth reading. For now, I just want to pick up one philosophical bit that he writes in here and just see what you guys think. From ancient times, it has been the role of the philosopher to show us how we should think of death, so as to overcome our fear of it. Epicurus, and following him Lucretius, argued that there is nothing to fear in death, since death is nothing. I do not survive it, so there is nothing bad for me on the other side of it. In an important sense, death doesn't happen to me. When I am, death is not, and when death is, I am not. That is just one example of the attempt to neutralize the fear of death by thinking. I'd like to put that to you, Marcy, if I can, especially in your work you're doing in the Theological Society, the talk about encounters with the fear factor and how you help people address that.
Well, to be honest, I haven't yet begun my clinicals.
Yeah,
So I can only draw on what I've done up until this point. But up until this point, my experience was the fear of childbirth. And if you walk in the street, if you sit in a cafe, people talk about their birth, that, you know, with a great deal of fear of how painful it is, even if they haven't gone through it, the fears of pain. I think pain is one of the things that we fear. So probably in death, we are afraid of pain. And I don't know how you lean into pain. I mean, we do it when the term mindfulness is a big thing in our culture now, and using breath, you know, and just sitting and breathing. So even when there's pain, we know that just by leaning into it, by breathing, by being still into it, it becomes more manageable. It doesn't necessarily go away, but it becomes more manageable, or else the fear that causes tension, that resists, increases the pain or increases our idea of the pain. So I think you can apply this probably to end of life is sitting with it and breathing. Very simple things that we know work in many different arenas. And I think many people may poo-poo that and say, oh, it sounds new agey, but I think there's a truth to it. When we're anxious, we hyperventilate. And when we relax, our breath is long and full. And I would say, even if you have fear, it's easier to lean into when you are softer and remember to breathe.
Yeah, simple truth there. It kind of reminds me, talking about fear kind of reminds me of the old Woody Allen joke, you know, where he says, I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there when it happens. So I think that's the fear, that's the pain thing, right? People don't want to have to go through the pain of dying. They don't mind the idea they're going to die, but yeah, they just don't want to feel it. Interesting. Martha, do you have anything you want to say about that? I was particularly interested because I know when you were with Etta, pain management was a big factor.
Pain, yes. Pain is a big factor. And as Marcy pointed out, there are a lot of strategies for the actual physical pain. But I think in this case, in this conversation, from what I've experienced with families when I talk to them, we're talking about physical pain that is possible depending on why someone is dying. And yes, in cases it can be very painful, and as we've noted, palliative care that mutes that pain can be extremely valuable. But also, death is not always painful. I have had experiences where death has been painless and not medicated. But the other pain and fear that we're talking about is the emotional pain of the people who don't want to address the fact that they're going to lose someone who they love. And that emotional pain, I think, brings in a lot of fear and also shuts down the conversation. So how we address the pain of the individuals who are not dying, but who need to be present for the person who is, some of the ways I'm looking at that now are looking at other cultures that don't hold on to life the same way our culture does, and the medical profession that uses techniques to keep people alive that if we didn't have them, if they hadn't been developed over the last several decades, it's an opinion, but I think those people might have very much more, less painful and more, if you want to say, beautiful deaths than they have, because there are options to stay alive longer than you might otherwise in a previous time.
Yeah, I think it's.
May I just offer? I just want to qualify that dealing with pain, addressing pain, and having agency does not dismiss using modern medicine or pain medicine. There's ways of including and weaving together all of these methods.
Yeah, I think the other thing is when you said earlier, you said that it's a choice of how you want to live, not necessarily how you want to die. And, you know, that's when you're in pain, you're very much alive. It also makes me think of something else that is part of this conversation, and that is that choosing to do everything you can to diminish that pain and to live as long as you want is a valid choice. I mean, we're not talking about any sort of mass euthanasia here. We're not talking about being advocates for, you know, everybody should, you know, have an expiration date. And I want to make that in my personal experience, for example, with my father-in-law, it was a very interesting process where he left a family farm where he was, very much living on his own in his late 80s, and decided they needed help, and they moved into a community and transitioned to the higher levels of care. And towards the end, when he had aphasia and he couldn't really communicate very clearly, we had some conversations about, Joe, you could go back to the farm, for these final months, whatever it is, and final months, final days. You could go back to the farm and you could die there if you wanted to. And the word death made his eyes, widen. And it was very clear to me that he didn't want me talking to him about death, even though he was at the door. He didn't want me talking about that. He was content where he was. Leave me alone. This is my choice to be here in this setting, cared for by these strangers who are caring for me every night when my wife and I went home. This is a choice that he made, and I respect that choice. Now I got to see that, and my choice would be not to do that. But that was his choice to say, back off when I said, let's talk about how you're going to die. I don't know if that rings true with either of you.
Yes, I think that we're all having these conversations because we want to maintain as much agency as we can. And as far as the issue of losing your agency with the dementia situation, and I know that Marcy has personal experience with that with her mother. I have the great honor of caring for my mother for the last year of her life, and she did not lose any agency. And she made a very clear choice to end her life by stopping eating and drinking, and had a very peaceful, beautiful death. And she was very clear that that was her choice and nobody was going to impede it. So it's complicated, but what we're working towards is letting people know what their options are, living fully right up until the time that they die, and knowing that they will be supported in whatever decisions they make. And that is not that clear in our society right now, that exists. And this is why we're having this conversation, so people can seek out those who will support them in their decision to live fully and die as well as they can.
That's interesting. I mean, when you're talking, something came to mind for me is the leap of faith, right? That the trust that you have in the people around you, that they are going to respect your choices and they are going to act in your stead, and they're not going to let their own personal choice intrude. I wouldn't have wanted to die like Joe, but I wasn't going to put him in a car and take him back to the farm if that's where not what he wanted to have. So I think the idea of trust and that leap of faith that the dying take is huge and needs to be respected. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Marcy, before we move on?
I mean, that's a hard one, because you have, when they can't speak for themselves, then you have the ones who are more capable kind of talking amongst themselves and saying, what do you think? What do you think? Mm-hmm. And I guess this is one of the reasons why it's good if we can talk about it. Mm-hmm. But I agree with you, Dave, that we do have to respect at least what we can conjure from how they lived. Mm-hmm. And mm-hmm. if they feel safer in a hospital under the doctor's care, then we bring them to where they feel safest. But mm-hmm. even in the hospital, there'll be a time where we have to make decisions. Mm-hmm. And can we then go there? We're not bringing them to the hospital to live forever. Mm-hmm. Decisions may have to be made, go on a ventilator, not go on a ventilator, take them home, call hospice, different kind of things. That these are all part of the conversation. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And I would just like to add one other thought, that from a technical point of view, there is a document in New York State right now that you can put into your planning, and it specifically states that if you cannot nourish yourself or hydrate yourself, that you prefer that no one else do it for you. And so that if you have clearly discussed this with the people who will be caring for you, and if you've lost agency, they have that in hand, saying, this is clear. This, when she knew what she wanted, she set this in place. So I would recommend that if anybody look through the New York, it's called End of Life Choices New York. You can go on their website. It's in the chat. You can go on that website and see the documents that are available, and you can execute that document, which I have. It would be my choice, as well as my husband, and our son is fully aware of our choices. So then I think the most important thing is communicate with the people who are going to be there for you when you need them.
Interesting. Yeah, this leads to a question about agency, which you probably have answered it adequately, but I just want to make sure we touch on this, because this whole idea of leaning into death, obviously, you know, it's predicated on having the capacity of some level of self-determination. You have a level of mental and physical autonomy or agency that allows you to lean in, make choices, you know, let your wishes be known. I spent over a decade writing about the research being done in Alzheimer's disease, and nearly that long, you know, witnessing my mother-in-law actually die from the disease, and both writing about and experiencing that sort of death where you lose that ability to make a choice. She was very robustly alive, but mentally was completely incapacitated for years. And this idea of, you know, being able to proactively lean into death as opposed to waiting until you lose that agency is very important. Martha, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about this idea of self-determination, and how do we, you know, we don't really know how we're going to feel about it when we actually get there, but the importance of leaning in now as opposed to waiting till later, and thinking about it now instead of waiting till later. I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
It's a very prickly subject, because in our case, with our mother, she never wavered from her original choice right through till her lovely death. And she had her family around her the entire time and fully supporting it. And she communicated to all of her surviving children exactly what she wanted, and she was in charge. It's a rare situation. So but at the same time, it brings up for a lot of people, what are we suggesting? Are we suggesting that you not burden your family with living too long, and what is too long? So this is why I recommend that people get together with the people who love them, with someone else other than just the family members, someone who has no emotional investment in the choices that this person is making. And there are many people out there now doing this, being these kinds of witnesses, and you don't have to be a licensed individual to sit with a family, bring the information, answer questions, but just be sure that the person who is wishing to be heard is heard by those who are going to matter in the rest of their lives and in their death. And then allow the conversation to flow, and also let everybody know that whatever they might think at the time, they can change their minds. They may, you can tear up any piece of paper that you've signed, and then if you change your mind, I mean, your father-in-law wouldn't have had that agency, but there could be someone who makes one choice and then realizes a few years later, I don't feel that way anymore. I'm changing my mind. And so that has to be on the table too. There's a book that you can get that's a really lovely book from a place out in California called Sacred Crossings. And you're filling out this book with all sorts of, answering all kinds of questions about how you would like the rest of your life to go, and then your death. And the woman who published this says, please write in pencil, because you never know when you're going to want to change your mind. And I feel that's how I feel that this discussion has to be fluid and ongoing.
Great thought. Marcy, anything to add there?
I agree with Martha, and I think that I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, that's fair enough. We've all noted our personal experiences as we've been going through this. I just want to touch one more time on this idea that, you know, not everybody's always on the same page at the end of life. When you know, when the push comes to the shove, you know, when it's time, You might be dealing with a client where, the client themselves is no longer able to express their wishes. And the doctor is now saying, trying to make decisions for that person to have them stave off death as long as possible. And the family members can't agree what, the patient, the person dying might have chosen. When families have to reckon with these kinds of differences, what sort of supportive help and resources are available to them? I wonder if you guys could run down some of those places where people can look. Martha, you said it doesn't necessarily have to be a licensed person you're talking to, but what are some of the specific resources that are available to people to address these kinds of conversations and challenges? Marcy or Martha, either one.
Yeah, I'll offer that when my father was in the hospital at the end of life, my sister and I disagreed on what to do. And the doctor was pushing his choice on us. And I was very grateful because it happened that the nurse caring for my father referred me to the ethics committee in the hospital. This was the Veterans Hospital. I didn't know there was an ethics committee before this. And about 4 people came and we sat in a room and they were able to listen to me just simply talking about my dad when trying to make the proper choice. And my father ultimately made his own choice because even from a comatose state, his life ended, but before we started any kind of treatment. But I would say if you're in a hospital and things are posed to you and there's some differences with your siblings or whoever you're involved with, the ethics committee or the hospital social worker are there within the hospital setting to be of support.
Great. Martha, anything?
Yes, just that I think hospice is I know it's a complicated question about hospice right now because it's not, there's no universal hospice nationally. It's state by state and sometimes community by community, how hospice gets paid and all those sorts of things. But they do have a lot of resources and they can be very, very helpful. And just as a little side story is that when our mother was ready to stop eating and drinking, I wanted her primary care doctor who had cared for her for 25 years to request hospice because there are hoops to jump through to request hospice. And I called his office and I asked to speak with him and I told why I was calling and he wouldn't get on the phone with me. And he said she had to come in and be evaluated by him before she would call hospice, which infuriated me, of course, because I was there with her for the many months before and she wasn't getting out of bed anymore. So that wasn't physically possible for her to go in and be evaluated by him. So in my rage, I had the good sense to call hospice myself and say, what do I do here? Because we need hospice and her doctor won't call you. And she said, no concern at all. We have hospice doctors who will come and visit your mother. And that's what they did. They sent somebody out the next day. She evaluated my mother. She said, obviously she is doing this on her own. She's not going to eat and drink anymore. Of course, she is eligible for hospice. So we need to educate from sort of medical school on up. But yes, I would say in your answer to your question, hospice is absolutely an organization that should be called on. And also there is a national organization called Compassion and Choices, which I think has been put into the chat. And Compassion and Choices is a free, available organization in every state. And you can talk to people, you can make calls and talk to volunteers who will fill you in on what services are available.
Terrific. Thanks, appreciate that. We're getting up on the time where we want to leave a block for Q&A. So while folks are putting questions into chat, I'd just like to take a couple of minutes to read from my book. And it's just a section I wanted to share that that gets at this question of the pleasure, pain, choose to live, choose to die. One of my main characters, Rose Geddes, is dying of lung cancer. And during her convalescence, she speaks to her dead father about where she is in her personal tug of war between life and joining him. And I just want to read this segment, and then we'll get to your questions. Rose never suffered pleasures sturm and drown in silence. To emote is to give thanks, monosyllabic prayers to no deity in particular, just expressions of gratitude for her five senses and the natural world's ability to thrill them. Her dad used to say, we humans have a finite capacity to indulge in the world's infinite gifts. Once you've exhausted that capacity, you're either really boring or you're dead. And I'm not interested in either one of those states of being. I miss it all, Rose says. Every crumb, whiff, hue. I'm not afraid to die. I know you think I am, but it's not that. I still miss it. Don't want to let it go. When will I be ready? Well, it comes down to the contest between pain and pleasure. As much as I love my pleasures, I'm no fan of this pain. I just can't stand the idea of pain winning. If my expressions of pleasure are my little prayers, then my responses to pain are unholy curses, howls, tantrums. Staying alive is my final tantrum. But I don't want to go kicking and screaming. I want to go out on the wings of one of my little prayers, grinning smugly at the caped concierge as he ushers me down that dark hallway. I wish I could draw a hard line like you did. Just say today's the day, but I don't have your certainty. I keep thinking I'm going to miss out on something grand. One more difference between us that I fail to recognize. Rose allows her dad to drift away and relaxes back in her chair. Today she feels pretty good about where she's sitting on the pleasure-pain continuum. A thin veil of clouds dulls the sky's blue, but not her mood. She hears the back gate open and close, and her mood brightens further with anticipation. She's made a new friend of sorts, or perhaps more accurately, an ally. Either way, her world is one person bigger. The book? The book is The Femme Fatale Hypothesis, and it is available for pre-order and will be available on November 19th. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you have some questions for us. Kim?
There are questions, starting with the question about resources and how that can impact the family's financial situation and inheritance, specifically even your experience with Joe, Dave.
I'd be happy to start because Joe, for a variety of reasons, had excellent resources available to him. And so as a result, it was part of his legacy, his financial legacy anyway, was the decision to stay in the home. But that was his choice, and he could fund it. So there was there's no problem within the household. It wasn't costing us anything to keep him in that care, but it was expensive. It cost much more for him to live under that care than it would have cost him to live with a home nurse and at his farm in upstate Pennsylvania. So it was a very interesting choice on his part not to invest the resources in wanting to be at home, but who might argue he liked it there. It was cozy for him, so he made that choice. It was not a tax on our resources, and also and neither was it his wife who went through dementia care there at the same facility. It was very costly for a significant period of time. I would not want anyone who did not have the resources for that to have to. I mean, the numbers were kind of staggering, and I think it's really something that we need to address in this culture.
One of the other questions is about death doulas and what resources there are to find these kinds of people who can provide this service and help, and how you feel about that.
Go ahead. Either one of you deaf doulas want to deal with that?
Well, I have to say that I have a complicated relationship to people getting paid a large sum of money to sit with the dying, but I understand that that is required by some families. Ideally, the way that I did midwifery in the home where the primary caregivers were the family who was receiving a new child. If that could be the model where people take care of their own, and I realize not everybody can do that, but if we could return to that model, as Marcy had alluded to early in this conversation, about a community that cares for its own, we could avoid creating a whole new layer of people who can afford to be cared for, as opposed to those who get warehoused. And I have just briefly another situation where an elderly couple had no resources left, and it fell, as this is not that uncommon, I think, to their children to care for them and they lived for quite a while. So their children cared for them and financially, and that put a serious strain on that family unit. So we need a better model, and I think community-based, and if you can find people who come together and care for each other, that's the best.
I will agree with you, Martha. I think even in birth, the only reason the profession of doula has come about is because we don't live in the extended family and community environment. So traditionally, when a woman would go into labor, her mother, her auntie, her sister, plus the midwife would show up and be with her. And now when we have the nuclear family, or people don't have an extended family of women to be supporters, or as an example, you know, because we fear birth so much, people don't even want to be part of it. Then we have a profession that grows out of that called doula. And I never thought about the fact that they're making money being death doulas. For some reason, I imagined it as a volunteer position, but obviously I'm wrong with that. So I agree with you on that. I mean, if we're able to have these conversations within families and communities, we're not going to need paid people to sit with the dying.
I would just like to add one more piece to that, to the Joe and Susan story, because they're the example in our family where they actually checked into a facility. There's an added wrinkle here where you have to demonstrate that you need the assistance that they provide there. You have to be incapable of, you know, managing your meds, or, you know, getting to the bathroom, or whatever it is, for the insurance to kick in and to help out, that sort of thing. So very gradually, what ends up happening is, in order to get the insurance coverage, they start taking certain things away from you in terms of self-management. And as things are taken away from you, you watch your elders' world shrink. They're not allowed to, you know, drive a car anymore. They're not allowed to take a walk alone anymore. They're, you know, various things they're not allowed to do more and more. And you watch their world shrink. And that is probably the saddest thing about watching my father-in-law die, is just watching his world shrink around him as things were taken away from him. I think that's an important consideration when you think about putting somebody in a facility of this kind of care. You realize that they just start doing things for you, and when you stop doing things for yourself, you die. You basically die.
Dave, if I can add, when we grow older, it's people who are younger that make decisions for us, whether it's even in an assisted living facility. It's younger people who don't have a clue what it is that we want or need. And until the voices of the elders talk amongst each other. And when we're able-bodied and able mind-wise to convey what we want, and then I think the whole system is going to begin to change. I don't think assisted living is a good system. I think I have seen its flaws, and I think we need the voices of the elders, and not just the younger people who think they know what the elders want and need.
That gets to it's more of a comment about the kinds of questions that people need to be asking as they prepare themselves or their loved ones for hospice or palliative care. Knowing the questions to ask 24/7 care, a host of other issues. Do you, either of you, know good resources for just that kind of planning?
Well, I think I mentioned Compassion and Choices is a tremendous resource. You can go state by state, whatever state you're in. We may have people out, I'm in New York, but we may have people in other states certainly tuning in. You can go to compassionandchoices.org and go click on your state, and you'll find multiple resources, including volunteers who will have conversations with you. Specifically, as I said, in New York, there's End of Life Choices New York, which also offers all sorts of resources. There are now, through hospice, through various lawyers who help people get their planning in order. They can also, many of them, I don't know about many of them, but one I know is quite sensitive beyond just the legal aspects of putting people in touch with resources. So there are a lot of people out there right now. And I think if anybody has, I would be happy to have my email put in the chat if someone just wants to get in touch with me, and I can share whatever knowledge I have and resources for someone. But there are a lot of people out there willing to have these conversations now and guide people.
Oh, you gotta unmute. Gotta unmute.
Unmute myself. I'm reading the emails and trying to look at the questions at the same time. Martha, can you talk a little bit about your suggestion that people write their own obituaries as a way to think about how they want to live and die?
Yes, thank you. When I have been consulted, there are two things that I specifically bring up just as an exercise for the individual as well as the family to consider in allowing the conversation to go forward. And one of them is that I ask the person who is planning for their end of life to write, or ask someone who loves them to write about them, what they would like said about them after they die. And it's a wonderful exercise, actually, whether someone does it for you or you do it for yourself. And the other thing, the concrete thing that I ask someone to answer is what they want done with their body after they die, because it seems like common sense, but when most people would like to die at home, even though most people aren't dying at home, but most people say that they would like to die at home, but then they don't think that there's going to be a body in this home at some point, and something has to be decided about what to do with it. So if you ask somebody to think about what they would like to happen to their body, and I don't just mean whether there's burial or a cremation, but rather how that process of where that body will go and then what will happen to it, and the visual of what that would look like, it gets people thinking really concretely about the ritual of death. And so there's that, but also it's a practical matter, because it could be, oh, okay, somebody's died. Now what do we do? Well, you actually have to plan ahead. You can't just call a funeral home to come collect a body without pre-planning, because who knows, they might call the homicide detective at that point. So you really do have to plan ahead and think about it, what will happen. And you also don't want to call 911, because if someone has planned to die at home and they have died at home, they do not have to be transported to the morgue. There's no reason why the body has to be transported by 911. So anyway, those are just things that I like people to begin thinking about concretely, so it opens up the conversation.
Martha, this happened to my mother and her husband. My stepfather died at home, had all the DNR and everything, do not resuscitate. And my mother, when she realized he had died, she called his doctor, and his doctor directed her to call 911. And she did not know what would happen. She did what he said, and when they came and they started resuscitating him, she said, stop, stop, stop. And it was, I mean, they did not resuscitate him, but it was a very painful experience. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Could I just say one other thing quickly about that, which is a lot of people say that they want to be organ donors. And just to be clear, you can't die at home and be an organ donor because it's just not possible. If you can just visualize, you can't harvest an organ from, well, there are certain parts of the body that might, after a certain amount of time, still be considered usable. But if you want to be an organ donor, you have to think ahead that you will have to die in the hospital, and then do your research to understand what that means to be an organ donor. And if you really want to die at home, you're not going to be able to be an organ donor.
This question comes from someone who had a very positive experience with her husband's hospice care years ago, about the unspoken understanding between the patient and the patient's family and the hospice team, that the patient would like help transitioning into essentially what is assisted suicide from the questioner's perspective. And just wondering your thoughts, and said if it feels too personal to pass over it.
Oh, and it's not too personal, but just language is so powerful, and it's not suicide. And the end of Aid in Dying has worked really hard to get the word suicide out of the dialogue, because when someone commits suicide, it's usually referred to by someone who is alive and well, and perhaps not actively in the act of dying, but chooses to take their own life. And many times, unfortunately, suicides are quite violent. End of life aid in dying is a completely different approach to getting the death that you are hoping to get. So, and I appreciate this question, because that again is where I think hospice comes in, because they do understand there is a respect without judgment for the person and the family, and part of their job is to not, I'm not suggesting they necessarily facilitate the dying, but they don't in any way try to talk the family or the individual out of moving forward if that's where they're going with their medications. It's usually, in this case, with medications.
We also have just a lovely comment that it seems that expanding the conversation to include not only dying, but also cultivating a place called home, a sense of peace, can go a long way toward moving death back into the home and community rather than out to the institution. And from Amy Cunningham, there's a link to a lovely video on shrouding of the body at home or hospital that Amy's included in the chat.
Thank you, Amy.
And then we don't have any more questions unless anyone would like to add something in at this point.
Do you have anything you guys want to say? Anything you didn't get a chance to say, Martha or Marcy?
My question, I just have a question. How do we keep some of the things in the chat for after we close? Are we able to access these things that were posted?
Louise is keeping a list of everything, and we'll share that along with the recording in a few weeks. It'll be up on our website and on David's website, and we'll send out an email to all of the participants in this program so you can share it with those that you know.
Great.
Well, I would just like to say thank you again, Dave, for writing the book that allowed me to join you for this conversation, and to thank Marcy as well, and the Old Stone House for sponsoring, and Louise for pushing through, Louise Crawford for pushing through it with the idea. And it's always a pleasure for me to have this conversation and engage other people in it. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I like to
Thank
ditto
you
that.
for
Thanks
inviting
again.
me as well.
Yeah. Thank you to Martha and Marcy. Thank you to Louise. Thank you to, by the way, Brooklyn Social Media, Louise Crawford, the Brooklyn Book Festival for including us in the program. Thank you so much. Kim, thank you. Wonderful host. And thanks to the folks who managed to show up on a beautiful Sunday afternoon out here. I don't know how the weather is where you are, but boy, I'm going outside.
Enjoy your evenings, everybody. Thank you so much for being here to have this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.